And hello, everybody. This is Jonathan Cragle for the Unleash the Cragle podcast. I want to thank you for being here today. And today I'm going to jump right in without a lot of fanfare. Today I'm going to talk about grief. And it may be a multi-part episode. This will be kind of a one episode where I'll cover quite a bit of ground because there may be those who only listen to this episode and I want to reach them. But I will have follow-up episodes in the coming weeks to talk a little bit more detail and so forth regarding grief and the grieving process, but also some tips and such to both things to think about for those who are grieving and those who are alongside friends, other folks who aren't sure what exactly to do for a person who's grieving. So let's jump right into it. So when it comes to grief, I have, I guess you could say, unfortunately, a lot of experience with grief. And I think I alluded to that in my previous episode about my dad being killed in an accident when I was 16. I've lost a brother. My mom's mom, my grandmother, died from a very quick illness 2 weeks before I was born. My mom, as far as grief, not so much loss of life, but my mom had Parkinson's disease from the time she got it diagnosed around age 38, and she died at 82. So you can figure out and add up how long she had it. Over half her life, she had Parkinson's disease and the effects of it. Like I said, my dad was killed. I've lost a brother who one of my sons is named after. And in the last 3 months or so, I've lost a son. Also have family members, extended family, daughter-in-law, whose mother just passed away suddenly. And so death has touched my family and me very closely. Certainly there's grief for other things, loss of opportunities, loss of job, loss of relationship. I also am divorced, so I've experienced that sort of death of a marriage experience. But the one area I want to really focus in on, because I think it's something that's talked about, but I think it's important to me to discuss to my group of, my circle of friends and family, and those of you that happen to be listening, is specifically on death. Simply because it's something that we don't want to talk about, we don't want to think about, but when it happens, we need to have the tools to manage and to go through the process well. And so grief is sort of like, to me, and I've tried to explain or try to think about it in a way that would make sense to people who maybe haven't gone through this, haven't lost a parent or a family member or a child, how to exactly explain it. And really, in some ways, it's sort of like you're out in the middle of the ocean and, grief or this experience of death happens and you begin the grieving process instantly. And it's like your boat gets completely smashed and you're in the water, you're alone. You see sort of an island out in the distance, but you're not sure if you're going to be able to get to it. And all around you are the pieces of the life that you once knew. And we didn't choose, just like a person doesn't choose to have their boat smashed during a storm and destroyed. We don't choose the experience of losing someone. And so the problem is just like when you get dumped into the water, you don't have a choice. I mean, your choice is really either fight to survive, fight to continue on towards that island, towards, staying above water, or letting yourself drown. And so what we have to evaluate is not whether or not we're going to be able to choose to go through this or not, but how do we go through the process of grief? How do we try to not just pick up the pieces of our old life, but manage the fact that this person who is very important to us is now gone, and that our life as we knew it, just like the boat that we were happily sailing in or floating in the water, happy as can be, is gone. And now we have to find a way to recover from that. The one thing with grief is everybody's experience is different. There are similarities. So when I was growing up, I have a brother who's a doctor, and I remember very distinctly him reading and having to read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying. And it's one of the books that they read, or I believe they still read, should be read for those in the medical community, but it's a great read for all of us to read, because what it gives us is sort of a framework, a basic framework. We know, but it was the first real framework of how to go through grieving. And so what I'll read is just, you may have heard this, but just so we're all on the same page. Basically, the steps of it are: shock and denial is the first step. When the death or when the person's lost, you go through shock and denial. The denial of them being gone, the shock, just almost the numbing effect of that experience of hearing that they're no longer here, that they're no longer alive, that they're gone. The second step is pain and guilt. And then the third step is anger and bargaining. The next step is depression and reflection. And finally, acceptance. These are general frameworks and general things that we can look at and evaluate in a framework. Now, this is as far as going through grief. It doesn't specify. This was written more for, originally for those who were experiencing death and dying in the process of that. But these can be very similar to the loss of work, the loss of a relationship, and so on. So shock and denial. So that it's the initial reaction that we have, and our body has a flight or fight mechanism. But what happens is, physiologically, our body goes into almost a shock when we experience, a jolt that is different than the norm. So we have sort of a normal rhythm that we go through. Each of our rhythms are a little bit different, but it's our normal rhythm. And when we hear news of a person close to us dying, or news of them having, a disease, we end up in shock. Our body goes into shock to protect ourselves and our psyche, and basically our well-being. But the difficulty of that is that we have to be able to manage that in a way that is healthy. And so when you go through shock and denial, you basically are saying, no, I don't believe it. I don't believe they have this. I don't believe I have this. I don't believe they're gone. It's just yesterday they were alive. I was talking to them, just, as I related about my dad. I had a fight with him the night before, made up, apologized, told him I loved him, went to bed, and that was the last time I saw him alive. The very next day he was hit and died 24 hours after we had our fight and makeup, so to speak, and coming to kind of closure with one another in a good way. And so I went through shock and denial. And the other interesting thing is, if you do not go through these steps in order, basically I'll say in order. I mean, there can be some adjustments to it, but some could take longer to go through the steps than others, depending on each person and their situation. But I can tell you this unequivocally: if you don't go through all these steps, they'll just wait for you to go through them later. And so in my case, I didn't go through all these steps when my dad was killed. And there were some reasons why, I believe, and through counseling that I learned why. And I'll help you, those that are trying to assist those that are going through grief. I'll give you some tips on what to not say or what not to do or so forth, because we can actually contribute to stunting a person's growth and processing and going through the process of grief without even, unwittingly I'll help you with that also. But basically, you're going to go through these steps. In my case, my dad was killed at 16. I didn't go through the steps of grief for my dad until I went through my divorce counseling and was in counseling for my divorce 20 years later. And so I can unequivocally tell you, don't try to speed or gloss over, because grief will sit there and wait until you fully process it. And so it's really critical that you understand that, and we don't just try to make it go away quickly, because without the grief, we don't have a chance to have full closure for ourselves and even that loved one that's lost or gone. A second is pain and guilt. Once you start to realize that the person's truly gone, there will be intense pain. So now the shock's worn off, and it's sort of like an injury that's happened, that you will now feel the pain. And you can try to dull that pain through alcohol, through drugs, through dangerous activities or activity or any number of things, but that dull pain will be there. You also might go through some guilt about, like, if you had had a fight with somebody and that was the last time you saw them, and then the next day they died or they're gone. You might have guilt about things you didn't do, didn't say, time you didn't spend with them, things that you wish you had done differently. So those will kind of combine together, and it's a really precarious time, because there's not the shock to offset you doing something dangerous to yourself or to others. But it also is a case where we can put ourselves into really dangerous situations if we don't have assistance around us in this, as we go through this part of grief. And so I equate the pain, for those who've not experienced it, to me, and it could be different for every person, but when the shock wears off, it's like a dull ache right below my sternum and goes right into my stomach and belly area. And it's a dull pain, but it's an intense pain. It kind of goes between burning and dull. And it's everything I can do to keep moving forward, whether it's waking up, whether it's going about my day in a normal process. It's in some semblance of more than just wanting to simply, sleep and hope that the pain goes away. But the reality is that pain needs to be dealt with, just like an injury. When you lose someone, it's like a scar occurs on your body. That scar could, you could have scars from surgery, but you have this scar of this intense wounding of yourself and your being through this loss. And that scar isn't going to go away. But if you don't deal with it properly, it will infect the rest of who you are, who you're being, and can affect your quality of life and so forth. And so what we really want to be able to do, just like we would deal with an actual wound to our body, we need to go through the process of grief to heal that area. In my case, I would say that I have wounds covering quite a bit of my body through loss. And yet each one of those now, through proper understanding, proper counseling, proper self-care, and being aware of that, those wounds are scars that I could look at. Others don't see them, but I know they're there. But I look at them now as not trying to avoid the scar, but as a reminder of that loss. And that's what we're trying to do. The same as we would recover from a surgery or an injury, we go through the same thing in the midst of grieving a loss. So next is anger and bargaining. So anger and bargaining is the next step that you'll go through, and it's finally when the shock is all gone and you've kind of gotten through the pain and guilt. Now you're angry. You're angry at, whether you're angry at God, you're angry at life, you're angry at the person who may have hurt or, led to the death of your, a family member or friend, maybe the family member yourself. They didn't take care of themselves. They didn't do the things they were supposed to, and they died, and you're angry about that. But a combination of that is then also bargaining. And usually, this isn't a case of grief in a death because there's nothing really to bargain. But if you're dealing with grief as far as cancers and sicknesses and illnesses or sudden traumatic things, you'll bargain. Hey, I'll do this if the person gets cured, or angry. Why do they have to go through this? And again, we have to go through this process because you can't just be a robot. You would be angry that somebody didn't take care of themselves, or that somebody got injured through no fault of their own, or whatever. And so you need to do that. And one of the things that freed me was in counseling. For the longest time I couldn't wrap my head around it, but when my counselor had me go ahead and write a letter to my dad about about dying. And I thought, well, it wasn't his fault. He didn't choose to. But when you write that and express out the feelings of the anger, it's not directed at the person. It's directed at the action of being gone, that loss. And we all feel it, but it's like in society, we're supposed to just put that down. And we have so many things that seem to be supposed to help us manage our grief, but they end up actually stunting or hurting us by being free to be angry at a person for dying. It's okay, and you will then release that, and then you can turn and have full love towards them. Again, I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact that we're directing anger at the person. We're directing, we're saying, hey, I'm angry you died, not I'm angry at you for dying. And there's a big difference, but I'm angry at you for dying is different and is freeing versus I'm angry at you dying. So I hope you can see kind of the gist of the difference of those, that one is directed at the action, the other's directed at the person. The first one's healthy, the second one is not healthy, and we want to make sure to go through that process in that way. Next, step 4 is depression and reflection. That's the part where you kind of go back through the next step of you had shock, you had pain, you're now angry, and now after all that kind of battling, there's this sort of depression of, and the reality, the reflection on that, okay, this has happened, this is going on, and I have to be able to manage it. I have to manage going on in life without this person, a father, a mother, a spouse, a child. And so, but there's that period again, sort of that, I would say, precarious part where you need to have counseling, you need to have people around you, because it's easy to slip into a bad depression, a depression that's debilitating. It's okay to feel that kind of sadness, and that okay, this is reality now. That's healthy. It's a good thing. And then finally we get to acceptance. Okay, this has happened. You accept, hey, they're gone. They're not going to be back. They're not coming back. And I need to move on in my life, not forgetting or stop thinking about them, but simply accepting the fact that this is reality now. And also, I think the other thing we have to accept is that as we go through this process of grief, if other people aren't directly involved with this situation, if it's not their family member, their child, their whatever, they'll feel sadness. They'll feel bad for you. They may grieve some, but their life is going to go a lot quicker. They're not going to go through the steps of grief like you do. And it's important to understand that because, again, life needs to move forward, but you have to understand that the rest of society is going to move on. And they'll be reminded of, those close to you will be reminded on the anniversary almost always when you bring it up. Like maybe you make a post or something, or you have a note that, hey, I'm going to go to the gravesite of my parent or my child or whatever, or this is the anniversary of my child's death, or my parent's death. Then people will feel sad again, and they'll have that, I'm really sorry, or hey, I loved your parent, or whatever. But you, as the person who is directly involved, are going to go through this process, and you're going to remember for the rest of your life. So those are the steps. I think and we could talk about each one, and I probably will in some episodes talk about it. I think the very first one is shock and denial. I know that when each experience I've gone through, I've gotten better, not faster, but better at managing each of these steps. And so I'll talk about my most recent experience, and that's my son. He's 25 years old, going to be 26 in a few months, and he was autistic, and was in a group home, and he had been dealing with some health issues, but he's a big, strong, 6'2", 200-pound, well, close to 200-pound kid, young man, actually, or man, but he was dealing with some health issues and was struggling with those. And what it basically ended up happening is he had some episodes where he would just have pain in his head, pain in his body. And when you're autistic, especially a didn't communicate verbally, managing that is you just kind of have to let it run its course. Or you can sedate them and make them basically just sit there in a chair, not really functioning. But if you're going to let them live, they had to go through the process of letting this pain, manifest itself. And when it manifested itself, it had to be dealt with. Well, the way to deal with it was let him safely move around. Well, basically, not all the details are exactly clear. There's some unknowns, just simply testing doesn't show it. But in essence, he had an episode, fell asleep finally about 1 or 2 a.m., and they went back to check on him to give him his medication about 7:30ish in the morning, and they found he was non-responsive and had died basically shortly after he fell asleep. Well, the shock of that, I happened to find out about it on a Saturday morning, and I was doing other stuff, cheering on a friend who was, competing and qualifying for for CrossFit Games qualifications, and I happened to not see my phone when I got the notifications and such, and so I missed that by an hour. When I finally went out and got a hold of folks and such about it, I didn't expect it to be that my son had died. And when I got it, my first response was disbelief, shock, and then the emotion of just tears, both of trying to help him with his life and managing even from a distance. He was in a different state, but that emotion as a parent, that sheer overwhelming pain and shock hit me. And I think that's I don't know that I dealt with denial, because I think I dealt with enough loss that I wasn't in denial he was gone. It just he was fine. Everything seemed to be working fine over the previous week. And then suddenly you get the news, he's gone. That's it. He's gone. There isn't a chance for him to get healing over his autism. There's not a chance for him to go have a long life. There's not a chance for me to see him again. He's gone. And that shock and denial was very intense for him. When I have close family and friends who are gone, it's the same thing. When you finally hear, even if you know that they're on the verge of death, or maybe they're in the hospital recovering, or trying to recover, and maybe they're hooked up to machines, there's still that hope. There's still the hope that they can be cured. There's still the hope that they're going to come out of this. And when the news comes that they're gone, there is certainly sadness, but there's also that there's that shock and denial of they're gone. We want to fix things. That's in our nature as humans, to fix things. And death and loss are something that we can't fix that. What we can do is learn to manage all of the things that come after it. So we could talk more about these steps, but I think the important part is to understand those. Now, everybody's going to go through these processes a little bit different. Some will take a little longer. One suggestion I have for you, if you're someone who is, even if you aren't experiencing loss right now, uh, I would definitely say that the first thing you need to do is you need to reach out to someone. If you get news of a loss or preparing for a loss, you need to have in place someone you're going to call immediately and get a hold of them to share the news. We need to share our loss. We share our good news. We need to share the losses also. That also puts you in play for the idea that someone out there, you're not left alone, because it's one of the most lonely, intense, emotional situations that we'll ever experience as humans. Certainly, if you've ever had a breakup, if you've ever had a loss of a relationship, you know how intense the feeling of loss is. Imagine the loss of a loved one, someone close to us, but in this case, it's permanent. And so it, it's permanent in a relationship, but you can renew that. You can find a new one. You can rebuild a new one through a lot of counseling and change and so forth. When it comes to death, it's final. They're gone. So, like we have a will set up in case of our death, who are we going to call that is going to be the people that are on our list when we get this kind of news? I have a list of people that I call first. I call my priest first. Certainly, if it's family related, I call my family, get a hold of family first, give them the news, my kids, and so forth. And then my next call is to my priest. And then there's a few other family or friends who I will contact and inform them. It's in place. That way, I just know what needs to go as far as steps. If you don't, you will be left alone, and you can't have that at this point. So my first suggestion is make sure you have a list of who you're going to call if something goes wrong. In case of emergency, you have a list for that. Have a group that you're going to call in order in case of death, or in case of a situation of potential loss, or a grief process situation. The next thing I want to suggest to you is that if and when you get news of loss, the first thing you need to do is take some deep breaths, sit down. If you're driving, pull over. Don't be driving when you get the news. You can't be doing two things at once, and I can tell you, you will not be thinking clearly at the moment you get the news. You'll be in shock. So you need to pull over. You need to, if you're doing something, you need to remove yourself from that situation. Just say, hey, go to somebody and say, hey, I need to step away. If they truly need to know, let them know, hey, I just found out so-and-so passed away in my family. I need to, and get yourself in this place where you can sit and think and breathe. And we'll talk about breathing patterns and breathing processes, and how we can learn to breathe better in another episode, not just for death and grieving process purposes, but also for sport, for our health, and so forth. But you need to breathe. You need to take some deep breaths in, and you need to hold them and let them out slowly, and hold it and go into almost like box breathing, because you will get overstimulated, over intense. The intense pain will be so much that you will literally, it's like an injury. You wouldn't be driving if you got injured. You'd pull over quickly. The same happens in the case of finding out grief, news of a loss or a death. Those who, and I'll have additional episodes talking about ways to process. The next step I would tell you is get a counselor. You should have somebody in mind already. Start researching who can you go for. Certainly, marriage counseling is there, mental health counseling. You need to have somebody in place that you're going to be able to go to counseling. Going through loss by yourself, without going through counseling, especially if it's the first couple of really close losses, close relationships, father, mother, child, brother, very close friend, or family member. If you go through it without counseling, you won't really go through it. And there are things that you can grow and learn. And yes, counseling costs money, and that's why we want to have a good person, somebody that's qualified, not just taking our paycheck, our credit card, but is really there to assist. So research ahead of time who you would go to for counseling, because if it comes down to you doing this when you're going through grief, it'll be very, very difficult for you to do. So you have a place for a doctor, you have a place for a dentist, you have a place for an eye doctor. You need a place situated and set up, not only for yourself, but your family members for going through counseling and grief counseling. I think it's one of the biggest things it changed for me. When I went through my divorce counseling, I didn't expect to learn about, grief of my dad 20 years earlier, and yet it changed my life. And I really was freed for the first time from a lot of that baggage that I carried, a lot of things I didn't even realize I was carrying around. And so it really saved my psyche, saved my mind, saved my life, frankly. And so I want to encourage you, but get that in place now. Start to shop around people. And yes, maybe that changes. Maybe you don't go through the grief for 20 years and the person you pick retires. Keep that always updated and somewhere that is easily findable, so that the next call after close family, a priest or pastor, call the counselor and schedule to get grief counseling started right away. Okay, so now I have to take a look here. We're about 33 minutes. I want to spend a little bit of time talking to those who are trying to assist those going through grief. One of the things that's difficult when somebody goes through grieving is, what do we say? Do we say anything? Should I bring it up? I don't want them to cry. I don't want to bring extra tears. I don't want to rip the scab off of what's going on. The number one thing people can do is be there. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to do anything, directly. You can simply be in the person's presence. And it can be uncomfortable. If you're not the one grieving, it can be uncomfortable to have somebody just talking and suddenly break into tears. Or someone is just sitting there and they're quiet and they're not saying anything. You need to get comfortable being uncomfortable, because your friend or your family member needs that. That's what they need. And just like you would help them or rescue them from the mountaintop and do whatever is necessary to help them, in this case, just being there is first and foremost. Because if people don't have others with them that they can talk with, be with, cry with, you're leaving a person alone in one of the most traumatic situations you can go through. And so just be there. The other thing that I would tell people is try to be conscious about what you say to the people. So we always want to try to make things better. You're not going to make it better. Let me just tell you unequivocally, you're not going to make things better with your words, because the person has just lost something. They've lost a valuable person. They've lost their mother of so many years, their father of so many years, their child who they, was born and raised by them, their sibling who they grew up with. You're not going to make it better. So what we can do is be there, in union with them, just as a body, a support. So one of the things I want to list for those of you who are going through this, and it's always a good reminder for me too, even though I've gone through, grief and such, I don't always remember. And so I have to go back to my list here, and it would be worthwhile to even write this down on a little list so that you have kind of a grief book so you can look at it, what things not to say. Or actually, let me take it a different tact. Let me go first with what are things you could say. So things you can say is basically just simply, I am so sorry for your loss. Please know that I am here for you and I care for you. That's it. You can also say, I can't imagine what you're going through right now, but I want you to know you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here to support you in any way I can. Another one, your parent was such an amazing person and will be deeply missed. I know how much you love them and how much they loved you, and I'm here to listen or help in any way I can. And if you need to really have a long-winded thing, you can say, it's okay to take time to grieve and process your emotion. Everyone grieves differently. There's no right or wrong way to do it. Just know I'm here to support in any way I can. That way, it puts all of it to the person. You're telling them that basically you're sorry for the loss and that you're here to help or here to listen. Things you shouldn't say, and we all do, we all have. I know how you feel. Let me tell you, no, you don't. I've experienced every kind of loss imaginable, and yet I can't say that to the person because my experience of grief, we might have both lost parents, but our situations are completely different. So I can't know how they feel. I can know the emotion of the steps of loss or shock or denial, but I can't know how they feel. Another one is at least they're not suffering anymore. You know, I heard that when my dad passed away. People say, well, at least he's not suffering, but he's gone. And I couldn't express it at the time, but it made me really angry as I got older and when I was going through my divorce counseling, because it's like, even if a person's ill and they're not in pain, it minimizes the grief the person's feeling. And really, genuinely, it's more for your benefit to not feel bad about, or it's like you trying to minimize how bad you feel versus actually allowing the person and being there in the midst of their pain. Another one I've heard that you shouldn't say, everything happens for a reason. Nobody wants to hear that when they have a loss. Okay? That, again, it's frankly a pithy statement to say everything happens for a reason. It's simply something at this moment doesn't need to be said. Okay? Yeah, everything happens for a reason, but at the moment, the person's in pain. They don't need to hear any logical stuff of what happened or why it happened. What they need to know is that they have support for the suffering and the pain they feel and the loss. Another one is, especially with older people, they lived a long life. Well, my dad was 48 when he was killed. My mom was 82 when she died. The emotion of loss was the same. It might have been a little bit different because of what I lost in time, but the actual emotion didn't change. So telling me my mom lived a long life didn't change the loss any differently than losing my dad when I was 16. So just avoid saying that. And then finally, they're in a better place. Again, they might be. I believe my dad's in heaven, my mom's in heaven, my brother's in heaven, and so forth. Whatever your belief system is, you believe. But telling a person that they're in a better place, again, we're talking about loss and about the person that's in front of us, our friend, our family member, or somebody that we know. It would be better to just not even say a word to the person or just say, I'm really sorry for your loss and leave it at that than to add any of these other phrases. So be there for the person. Focus on listening to them or just do things like put together a meal train, pick up kids, do their laundry, do their lawn care, take care of tasks that so they don't have to, or order meal prep. One of the best gifts when my son passed away was some of the ladies from my CrossFit gym. One of the owners, Kaylee Lovelady, and Angie Thorpe and Katie Emmons, three of the ladies I want to shout out to here on the podcast. They just made a plan to get me meals so that I didn't have to cook. And so they got me 2 and 3 meals a day for a 2-week period, the 2 weeks following my son's death. And you know what? It was freeing. It was great because I didn't have to think about eating. And I know myself well enough that in grief, I don't eat very well. It's kind of the last thing on my mind. So if you could do that, that would be so beneficial to have prepared meals or just get meal prep. There's plenty of places around your area where you could basically just get a family style meal put together and delivered to them. And that's just one less thing they have to deal with. Those are the kind of things that you can do and help with and avoid saying the things that you shouldn't say. And again, we'll make mistakes, but as much as possible, be there. Don't worry about trying to make them feel better because you're not going to do that. Instead of going further, I'm going to do a second podcast about additional things that we can do to help those who are grieving. If you're listening to this and you are in the process of grieving, first of all, I want to tell you that I'm sorry. And I'm sorry for your loss. Whether it's a parent, a child, a sibling, a close friend, whatever you're going through, I'm so sorry. I do also want to say that if you are feeling depressed and you haven't reached out to someone, please do. If you do feel any kind of sense of depression or despondency that would cause you to harm yourself or others, there is the suicide hotline you could certainly reach out to. I will put that in the show notes. Otherwise, reach out to somebody and tell them directly and honestly where you're at. If it comes down to it, call 911. As much as that seems like too much or outlandish to do, I can tell you anything to help you in the midst of this intense pain you're feeling is worth it, and you're worth it. Death and grieving is hard. It's very hard. It's part of life. You know, I've had 3 grandkids born this year, March, April, and May. I've lost a son the day after the first of the 3 grandkids were born, and the next morning I found out my son had died in his sleep. So I've experienced birth and death. My second son and his wife had one of my grandsons in April. And sadly, and intensely sadly, her mom just passed away very suddenly. And so we're dealing with grief there also, and the loss of a beloved mother, grandmother, wife. And I want you to know, all of you who are listening, if you haven't experienced it, I'm so thankful, and you need to re-listen to the last podcast and celebrate and spend time with your family. You will, just because it's life, face loss. And hopefully a little bit of this podcast and this information can help you. If you have lost many like me, I hope that you will honor them in your life, in your actions, in your words, remembering their deaths, but also remembering the life and the very things that they gave you, the gifts they gave you and taught you and made you who you are. If you're not doing very good in that sense, this is your chance to start again and begin to honor them through your life. If you are doing well, keep it up, keep going, keep honoring them and relaying to your children the significance of this mother, father, child, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, whomever you grieve. Pass it along so that they understand. Thank you so much for listening. This is Jonathan Cragle. This is the Unleash the Cragle podcast. And I just want you to know that I care for each of you. Many of you I've never met, but I want you to know that you're cared for, you're loved, you're important. Not only to having you listen to my podcast, but also to all of those that you're close to. If you'd like to follow us, you can follow us on Instagram at Unleash the Cragle. You can also follow us on YouTube at Unleash the Cragle. You can email us at unleashthecragle gmail.com. Feel free to send any comments. If you could, please subscribe to each of our pages, Instagram, YouTube. Send us any comments via email. Subscribe, like our podcasts on the various platforms. We'll have it on YouTube. This will be on all the major platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and so forth. Also, if you could share with your family and friends, that would be great. We would love that, and it would allow us to produce even more content and reach even more people. Again, thank you again for listening. We will talk more about grief and some more processes and more steps. I'm hoping it helps. Until I talk to you next, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and when at all possible, please be kind to each and every one, even those you only meet on the street. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.